quote in Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen is explaining to Alice that down here in Wonderland, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. Now, this has been interpreted many ways, but the way I like to look at it is you can look at if you embrace a lie, if you indulge in a lie. It starts you down this rabbit hole. There's never just one lie. It always leads to an ever-growing, more complicated web. And you can see how one lie leads to another lie that's needed to bulwark the original lie. And eventually you're having to lie more and more and more just to stay where you were, just to stay in the same place. You've probably seen this in your own life if you've ever had someone that you've watched struggle with addiction. You can say, hey, John, let's go out to your garage, man. And you look out there and you say, what do you see? Nothing. You know, John, this whole garage is packed with whiskey bottles, empty whiskey bottles. Like, you've got a problem. And John can look you right in the eye, and he can look right at those whiskey bottles and not see the problem. John lives in denial. John is not a seeker of truth. John is a servant of power. Now, what is the recovery? There's this idea, there's a chemical dependency, and yeah, there's a component of that. But the first step to recovery from addiction is for John to go and say something true. Hi, my name's John. I'm an alcoholic. That is his first step, to stop living in denial and to start speaking truth. Where have we seen this in the modern world and modern politics today? Well, it's very common. We see this constant moving of the goalposts by the left. And you can see this all over the place. It doesn't take much digging to find this sort of thing. What you believe one day, you then have to be ready to disavow the very next. Take, for example, there was the whole defund the police thing. And then it became, defund the police doesn't really mean defund the police. And then they found out, yes, it did. And then Joe Biden just ran a $45 million law and order campaign. So which is it? Defund the police or law and order? Another example of this is mail-in voting. For months and months on end, CNN was posting articles. Mail-in voting is perfectly safe. There's no problems with mail-in voting. We already do mail-in voting. All of the experts have come out in favor of mail-in voting. And then just the other day, boom, narrative changed. And there's this article out about the chaos that's going to be caused by mail-in voting and all these legitimate concerns. Well, what changed? Well, there's a number of things that changed, but one is the Democrats found out that Black and Latino mail-in ballots are rejected at double the rate of Caucasian ballots. That means Democrat votes, at least statistically speaking, are going to be rejected at a higher rate than Republican votes. All of a sudden, you whipsaw. Here's another example, vaccines. Vaccines are perfectly safe. No one's ever been hurt by a vaccine anytime ever. Well, now Orange Man is like, I think we're going to have a vaccine before election. Well, all of a sudden, too fast. Vaccines are dangerous. And you have to be ready, like a school of fish, to all say, no, that vaccine isn't safe. And it's like, I thought you said all of our vaccines were safe. But that was yesterday. Why do you see this? Why does this happen? Well, the left, at its core, has embraced a philosophy of postmodernism. So what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is an intellectual stance that rejects certainty and stability of meaning. It questions or criticizes viewpoints associated with Enlightenment rationality. It rejects universal validity, binary oppositions, stable identity, hierarchy, and categorization. Postmodernism is associated with relativism and a focus on ideology in the maintenance of economic and political power. Postmodernists describe truth as relative. See, the left has rejected truth, and there's people that seem to struggle mightily with this idea. They have embraced a philosophy of postmodernism. That's where this intersectionality comes from, that a man can become a woman, or a white man can become a black man, or a white woman can become a black woman, or all these trans-species things. Truth is relative. That means there is no objective truth. Postmodernists go as far to claim that reality itself is nothing more than a mental construct, Where have we heard this? Race is a social construct, right? This is where feminism comes from. This is where critical theory comes from. This is where the idea of gender transitioning comes from. This is its philosophical foundation. They are rejecting the objective and are putting as primary the subjective, feelings over facts. Well, if there is no objective truth, you're going to have some problems, because then it simply becomes nothing more than a will to power. What is truth? Well, it's who has the power to impose that truth. And whoever has the most power can impose their version of reality on everyone else, so it becomes a fight for the ability to force a reality that is beneficial to you onto everyone else. You get this Queen of Hearts situation where Alice says there's no use in trying, one can't believe in impossible things. And the Queen comes back and says, I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for a half hour a day. Sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And of course, the Queen is the most powerful in the land. And anybody that crosses the Queen, anyone that interferes, anytime that objective reality pierces the veil, off with their head. Sounds a lot like cancel culture. This is how you establish authoritarian rule. This is why everyone is struggling to keep up with the whipsaws of the narrative. That's why Kamala Harris is able to go on Stephen Colbert and he can ask her, hey, you said some pretty tough things about Joe Biden's history with women. And she responds with, it was a debate. And he says, so you don't believe in any of that? She's like, it was a debate, Stephen. What was terrible and incorrigible and couldn't be accepted yesterday was Kamala Harris's truth yesterday. Today is she doesn't believe any of that Me Too stuff. It's all just about politically convenient narratives that lead to power. Now the issue is here, and I'm going to go back to my political garden. The roots of the left, the cultural roots that feed the political apparatus of left-wing politics, the roots of the left are shallow. They're very broad, but they're shallow. People vote for progressive parties for any number of superficial reasons. So it may be they like a particular entertainer. Maybe they like a particular book. Maybe they like a particular style of music. Sometimes it's just skin deep. Pure identity politics. I have this skin hue, so I vote for this person. I belong to this or that identity group, so this is who I vote for. Well, J.K. Rowling, in this fragile and shallow root system, you can get rid of many other actors. Like if they step out of line, like Owen Benjamin got kicked out of Hollywood for not endorsing trans kids. Boom. Yeah, no big loss. Comedy community is deep and robust, and there's plenty of people willing to take the knee. But J.K. Rowling is so big, she has her own gravity well. She dominates fiction. She dominates the movies. She is a massive cultural icon on the left that not only is irreplaceable, but is so big, she's almost unchallengeable. So she initially embraced the lie. She went down the rabbit hole, where she believed in things like the patriarchy and the wage gap argument. Well, why? Because it put women at the top of the totem pole. The top of the grievance totem pole was held by women, and she could stand there and use her vast resources and her soapbox, and she could be this virtuous figure that was fighting for women's rights in the West. Why don't you go fight for women's rights in the Middle East? That's a little more meaningful challenge. But she could pedestalize herself. She could enshrine herself in this godlike position. Now, because you got to keep running faster and faster to stay in the same place, it wasn't just enough to keep repeating the tired old cliches from the 70s, early wave feminism. It had lost its punch. You have to keep finding new things to be outraged about, so you invent new stuff. Until very recently, being trans was considered a psychological disorder, and it was treated as such. That was the medical diagnosis. Well, now it has become a cultural flashpoint because you've got to keep going further and further out in order to keep generating that same outrage, if that's how you're going to fuel it. Well, the fact that J.K. Rowling does not want to comply, that means they can't keep running. She can effectively put the brakes on a runaway phenomenon. Why do they hate this? And in case you haven't heard, she's writing a book about a straight man that is going to dress up as a woman and apparently is a killer. And so because she's refused to toe this "a man can completely turn into a woman if he wants to" line, she's labeled a TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist. And the activists are all up in arms. It's going to paint trans people in a bad light. And it's like, well, these are legitimate concerns. Who's to say that there's not some crazy person that's going to put on a wig who can now go where he shouldn't be allowed to go and do things he shouldn't be allowed to do? And it takes J.K. Rowling, who was at the top of the grievance totem pole, and puts her near the bottom. All of a sudden, think about it, all of a sudden men are at the top of the totem pole as long as they say, "I'm a woman." She wanted to go down to Wonderland, and she wanted to rule in the postmodern world where there is no truth, where truth doesn't matter, where the wage gap is real, where there's a patriarchy keeping women down. And she wanted to be the queen of that world, but she wanted to freeze it in place. She didn't want to have to keep running faster and faster to keep up with an ever-changing narrative. And why does the left fear this? Because she can effectively, because she's so big, she can effectively put the brakes on this hysteria. If she's not going to run, there's a lot of other people that aren't going to run. But if you don't keep running and running to stay in the same place and run even faster to get further ahead, what happens? You start going backwards. Gravity starts reasserting itself. This is why the left will not tolerate diversity of thought. It's like our friend John the alcoholic. As soon as he's willing to admit he has a problem, he goes home and all of a sudden he can see all the whiskey bottles in his garage. All of a sudden he can see what a mess he's made of his own life. Just like in postmodernism, you can decouple from reality. That doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. It means you've decoupled from truth. Because you get enough social momentum behind it, you can really push things to bizarre heights. But that doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. And when J.K. Rowling takes that first step and says, there is a such thing as male and female, she is going to her AA meeting. It's the first step to recovery. We're going back to the world of truth. And a lot of people struggle mightily and they relapse. But she does have the cultural gravity to prevent them from continuing to run faster and faster. But why would they want to stay in the same place? Well, because they have the political winds at their back. The politically convenient false narratives have served them well up to this point. And so what happens if they lose that? Well, that means the left ultimately loses political control. As Dr. Turley would say, a new conservative age is rising, and we see this all across the West. We see it in Poland. We see it in the UK, where Labour lost. It was the worst defeat for the Labour Party in like 80 years. We see it in the rise of the nationalist populist right under Trump here in America. But for those of you that were just dreaming of that new world order, who just couldn't wait to line up and trade in your explicitly defined constitutional rights for the implied rewards of a globalist superstate, let me tell you, serving power over seeking truth doesn't ever work out the way you imagine it would.